He was the kind of man you'd never suspect, polite, educated, disarmingly handsome. To his neighbors, Ted Bundy was a promising young law student, an aspiring politician with a perfect smile. But beneath that charm was a predator unlike any America had ever seen. Between 1974 and 1978, Bundy moved through the shadows of Washington, Utah, Colorado, and Florida, leaving behind a trail of terror, deception, and death. He was born Theodore Robert Bundy on November 24, 1946, in Burlington, Vermont. From the beginning, his life was a study in deception. His birth certificate listed his mother as his sister, a lie crafted by his grandparents to hide the shame of illegitimacy. Those early years in the dim, creaking house on North Avenue were filled with whispers and half-truths. Ted learned early how to smile through the secrets, how to pretend everything was fine, and how to wear the mask that would one day let him walk unnoticed among his victims. As a boy, neighbors recalled a child who watched, not spoke. His blue eyes were cold even then, curious, observant, detached. He would linger at windows for hours, studying people passing by as though trying to understand what made them human. The family dog, they said, once turned up bloodied, its injuries never explained. When Ted was older, he would collect knives, arrange them neatly under his bed, the steel glinting faintly when the light caught it just right. But to the world, he was the polite young man who carried groceries for old ladies and mowed neighbors' lawns without being asked. In high school, Bundy was clean-cut, ambitious, and quiet. He learned how to mimic emotions, how to be exactly what others expected. His teachers described him as bright and charming, but classmates remembered something else, an emptiness in his laugh, a distance in his eyes. He rarely dated, yet when he did, he was overly controlling. His charm quick to shift into cold silence when resisted. Even then, he understood that power wasn't in kindness, but in control. By the time he attended the University of Washington in Seattle in the late 1960s, Bundy had perfected his facade. He studied psychology, fascinated by the mechanics of behavior, perhaps searching for an explanation for the darkness within him, or a way to refine it. He volunteered at political campaigns, shook hands, and smiled for cameras. No one questioned the handsome young student with the pressed shirts and calm voice. He seemed destined for greatness, but beneath that smooth exterior, something else was growing, an urge he didn't deny, but nurtured in secret. He began following women at night, studying how they walked, where they looked when they hesitated. Each encounter, at first harmless, became a rehearsal. His confidence grew with every unnoticed trespass. He was no longer simply pretending to be normal. He was learning how to use normalcy as camouflage. Bundy's greatest weapon was never his hands or his strength. It was his charm, his ability to make others feel safe just long enough to let their guard down. In that comfort, in that false sense of trust, his darkness thrived, waiting, silent, behind the mask he'd been perfecting since childhood. It began in January 1974, in the quiet university neighborhoods of Seattle, where the winter rain blurred the streetlights and made every alleyway look the same. Women started vanishing, smart, kind, ordinary young women who had everything ahead of them. The first was Karen Sparks, a 21-year-old student who lived in the university district. One cold night, someone broke into her basement apartment while she slept. When her roommate found her the next morning, the scene was almost beyond description. Karen was barely alive, her skull fractured, her body violated with an instrument so brutal that doctors were shocked she had survived. She would spend weeks in a coma, waking with no memory of what had happened. Police had nothing to go on, no fingerprints, no witnesses. only the eerie sense that whoever did this had watched her, studied her, and chosen his moment with precision. 2 weeks later, on February 1st, another woman disappeared. Linda Ann Healy was 21, a University of Washington student, with a bright future and a warm smile. That morning, her roommates found her bed neatly made, her pillowcase missing, and a streak of blood staining the pillow beneath. Her bicycle was still by the door, her purse untouched. It was as if she had simply evaporated into the night. Detectives searched the area, combed the campus, and questioned friends. But there were no signs of struggle, no forced entry. What disturbed investigators most was the unnatural tidiness of her room. It looked staged, deliberate, almost ritualistic. Linda had been taken silently, efficiently, by someone who understood how to leave no trace. By spring, the disappearances spread beyond the university district. In March, Donna Gail Manson, a 19-year-old student at Evergreen State College in Olympia, vanished while walking to a concert. She was never seen again. A month later, in April, Susan Rancourt, another college student, disappeared in Ellensburg after attending an evening meeting on campus. Witnesses recalled a man with an arm in a sling, asking for help loading something into his car. He was polite, well-spoken, even charming. The detail seemed harmless until it appeared again. In May, Roberta Kathy Parks went missing in Corvallis, Oregon. Then in June, Brenda Ball vanished after leaving a tavern near Seattle-Tacoma International Airport. Each disappearance blurred into the next, different towns, different nights, but the same pattern of young women, all attractive, all with long brown hair parted down the middle. By July 1974, fear had spread like a fever across the Pacific Northwest. College campuses buzzed with rumors, and women were warned not to walk alone. But Bundy was growing bolder, his methods more daring. On July 14th, in broad daylight, Lake Sammamish State Park was filled with thousands of sunbathers enjoying the heat of summer. That afternoon, 2 young women disappeared within hours of each other. Witnesses described a man named Ted with his arm in a sling, asking women to help him load a small sailboat onto his tan Volkswagen Beetle. He was friendly, handsome, and confident. One by one, women had politely declined, except for Janice Ott and Denise Nasland. Both were never seen again. The name Ted and the description of the tan VW became the first real lead for investigators. Composite sketches flooded the media, and hundreds of tips poured in. Among the names submitted by worried acquaintances and co-workers was one that would later seem almost unbelievable. Ted Bundy, a law student in Seattle, known for his volunteer work in politics. Detectives looked into him briefly, but the idea seemed absurd. Bundy was articulate, clean-cut, and had no criminal record. There were too many Teds, too many Volkswagens. The investigation stalled, and Bundy slipped quietly into the background, watching the chaos he had created. That summer marked the end of innocence in the Pacific Northwest. Parents warned daughters to lock their doors, to never trust a stranger, no matter how polite. The nightly news was filled with photographs of missing women, their smiling faces fading into the background of fear. Bundy, meanwhile, had already begun to plan his next move. The killings had become more than compulsion. They were ritual. Each abduction, each careful act of control, fed something deep inside him. He had discovered that his charm could open doors that should have stayed closed. When investigators later revisited the early cases, they would see the same pattern repeating like clockwork: the broken lock, the vanished girl, the carefully cleaned room, the small details that seemed too precise to be coincidence. In every city he passed through, Bundy left the same invisible fingerprint, an absence so calculated it almost felt personal. Those who studied his crimes would later say that the first victims were his experiments. The early rehearsals for a darkness he had been perfecting all his life. As the summer turned to autumn, the Pacific Northwest slept uneasily, unaware that the charming young man they might have seen at the grocery store, the one who smiled and held doors open, was the very same man who prowled their neighborhoods after midnight, hunting quietly, methodically with the face of a friend. By late 1974, the pattern of disappearances had become impossible to ignore. Police departments across Washington, Oregon, and Utah began comparing notes, realizing that their missing persons cases shared unsettling similarities. The women all vanished without a sound, often from well-lit public areas, leaving behind no witnesses and no physical evidence. It was as though the killer moved through the world unseen, cloaked in the illusion of normalcy. Bundy understood the psychology of trust better than anyone. He didn't rely on force at first. He relied on empathy. His sling, his fake injuries, the polite voice asking for help, all crafted to disarm his victims. He studied their reactions, learned when to smile, when to act embarrassed, when to appear harmless. Every encounter was a performance, and Ted Bundy was a master actor on a stage no one realized existed. While detectives scrambled to make sense of the growing number of victims, Bundy's own life appeared stable, even impressive. He was attending law school in Utah, maintaining a relationship, and still volunteering in political campaigns. To those who knew him, he was the image of potential. He attended dinner parties, laughed at jokes, and discussed cases as though he were preparing for a promising legal career. No one saw the darker rituals unfolding behind his eyes. At night, he cruised the streets, searching for the right opportunity. The right type of girl, someone kind, trusting, perhaps a little tired after class or work. The mask of civility was always in place. Bundy knew exactly how to appear genuine, even vulnerable, while concealing the violent fantasies simmering beneath his calm demeanor. His car became his hunting ground. The tan Volkswagen Beetle, ordinary and inconspicuous, was the perfect trap. Inside, he had made small modifications, removing the passenger seat, keeping a crowbar and handcuffs within reach, a space designed for control. When victims stepped into that car, thinking they were helping a man in need, they had unknowingly stepped into their final moments. It wasn't just murder, it was domination, an act of total power. Bundy's mind fed off that power, rehearsing every detail in advance, savoring the manipulation that made his victims trust him up until the last breath. Each success emboldened him, reinforcing his belief that intelligence and charm could outmatch any suspicion. Investigators began to see connections, but the lack of physical evidence made progress agonizingly slow. Bundy's ability to blend in was his strongest weapon. He followed the news closely, fascinated by the coverage of his own crimes. When sketches appeared on television resembling his face, he smirked. The thrill of being almost caught excited him. He began attending community meetings about the killings, sitting quietly among those discussing how to protect themselves from the phantom haunting their cities. No one realized the predator they feared was sitting right beside them, taking notes on their fear, adapting his methods. He began to alter his approach, changing his appearance slightly, driving at different hours, traveling further between attacks. Every police alert was simply a new challenge for him to overcome. By early 1975, Bundy had transformed deception into an art. He mimicked empathy with chilling precision, mastering the subtle cues that made people feel safe. He laughed at the right moments, maintained eye contact, and spoke softly enough to seem trustworthy. In private, he practiced facial expressions in mirrors, refining his act like a seasoned performer. To him, murder wasn't just violence, it was control disguised as connection. He relished the moments before the act, when the victim still believed in his kindness, when the mask had not yet fallen. The pleasure came from knowing he could orchestrate life and death simply through charm and timing. His intelligence was his disguise, and his normalcy was his alibi. The police were closing in, though they didn't yet know it. Reports began overlapping across state lines, and witnesses repeatedly described the same man, tall, handsome, with a calm demeanor and an injured arm. They described his car, his name, even his smile. Yet every lead seemed to dissolve. Bundy's confidence grew. He began crossing state borders regularly, leaving bodies in remote locations across Utah and Colorado. The pattern of deception expanded into a network of confusion designed to waste police resources. He attended law classes during the day, studying criminal procedure while committing the very crimes the law sought to define. It was a twisted irony that pleased him deeply. Each time he walked into a lecture hall, neatly dressed and composed, no one suspected that the man taking notes beside them was the very killer whose motives they were trying to understand. The duality of Bundy's life became his defining feature. He could be tender and attentive with a girlfriend, then vanish for nights without explanation. He could shake hands with police officers, even volunteer on task forces discussing crime prevention. His entire existence became a game of masks, each one layered over the next, each lie more convincing than the last. Friends would later say they noticed small changes, a distant look, unexplained absences, an occasional dark mood, but no one imagined the scale of his deception. Bundy had crafted the ultimate illusion, living two lives so seamlessly that even he seemed to believe both were real. He had become the embodiment of the monster hiding in plain sight, a man so ordinary that his very normalcy became the camouflage for evil. In 1975, the killings stretched beyond Washington and Oregon, spreading like a quiet contagion across the western United States. Bundy's movements became unpredictable, his confidence sharpened by every successful abduction. He drove his Volkswagen Beetle through mountain passes and desert highways, vanishing into the anonymity of distance. Utah, Idaho, Colorado. Each state became a new hunting ground, each disappearance a whisper in the dark. Local police departments were overwhelmed, unaware that their investigations were fragments of a larger nightmare. The man they were all searching for was no drifter or outcast, but a well-groomed law student, blending effortlessly into the background. Bundy's charm disarmed strangers. His intelligence concealed the animal within, and his calm voice lulled suspicion wherever he went. In Utah, his arrival went unnoticed at first. He enrolled at the University of Utah's law school in September, attending lectures by day and prowling by night. The murders there began quietly, almost methodically. On October 18, 1974, Melissa Smith, the daughter of a local police chief, disappeared after leaving a friend's house in Midvale. 9 days later, her body was found in a wooded area, brutalized, and left posed in a way that suggested deliberate ritual. Only a month later, another young woman, Laura Amy, vanished after leaving a Halloween party. Her remains were discovered near a riverbed on Thanksgiving morning. The brutality shocked investigators. The injuries were consistent with rage, yet carried out with eerie precision. Bundy was experimenting, refining his control, testing how far he could go without being caught. By early 1975, Colorado began reporting disappearances that mirrored Utah's. Karin Campbell vanished from a hotel corridor in Aspen during a ski trip with her fiancé. Her body was discovered weeks later in a snow-covered field, miles from where she was last seen. The pattern was clear, but the man behind it remained invisible. Bundy's method of luring victims evolved with each encounter. He sometimes impersonated a police officer, flashing fake badges to instill trust. Other times, he pretended to be injured or lost. Whatever role he played, it was calculated to exploit empathy. He understood that kindness could be a trap, and he used it like a weapon. He could turn politeness into a snare, a simple conversation into a death sentence. Each time, the transition from charm to violence was instantaneous. A switch flipped behind his eyes. Investigators began to suspect a single killer linking the growing list of missing women. But the geography of his crimes made coordination nearly impossible. This was before databases, before communication between states was efficient or fast. Every sheriff's department worked in isolation. Every case file, another piece of a puzzle too scattered to assemble. Bundy exploited this chaos, driving freely across borders, adjusting his accent, his hair, even his demeanor, depending on where he was. In one town, he was the friendly stranger. In another, a polite law student. He learned to disappear, not just physically, but socially, blending into new circles before anyone thought to look too closely. Even as composite sketches circulated and his name was mentioned by concerned acquaintances, no one could make the image of a charming, intelligent man align with the horror they were chasing. His life, on the surface, remained strangely intact. He maintained a relationship with Elizabeth Klopfer, a woman who loved him deeply, but sensed something wrong beneath his smiles. She would later recall the small inconsistencies, the nights he vanished without explanation, the strange items she found in his apartment, the way he could turn cold in an instant. Once, in a moment of panic, she even called the police to report her suspicions. Her description matched the composite drawing exactly, yet detectives dismissed it. Bundy was too normal, too successful, too likable. It was unthinkable that the killer haunting half the country was the same man who brought her flowers, but cracks were beginning to show. Traffic stops, witness sightings, and tire tracks began to link him to crime scenes in multiple states. In August 1975, near Salt Lake City, a highway patrol officer noticed a tan Volkswagen Beetle driving suspiciously. Inside, he found ski masks, rope, a crowbar, and handcuffs, tools that seemed innocent enough when Bundy explained they were for skiing and camping. The officer let him go with only a citation, unaware that he had just released one of the most prolific killers in American history. It was a moment of near capture, one of many close calls that only deepened Bundy's arrogance. The thrill of evasion became part of the ritual. As 1975 drew to a close, Bundy's freedom was beginning to fray. His name appeared more frequently in police reports. Detectives in multiple states began sharing notes, realizing their cases fit together too neatly to be coincidence. Still, without forensic evidence or a confession, they were chasing shadows. Bundy, ever composed, continued to live as if untouchable. He attended law classes, smiled for photos, and dated as though nothing lurked beneath the surface. But behind that calm exterior, the tension was building. The law student who once studied the justice system now lived within its blind spots. He was no longer simply deceiving those around him. He was daring them to see through the mask, challenging them to catch the man who, by all appearances, did not exist. By the beginning of 1976, the illusion was beginning to crack. The charm that had carried Bundy so far was starting to falter under the weight of growing suspicion. After months of evading police, his luck shifted when officers in Utah arrested him on a routine traffic stop. Inside his Volkswagen, they found masks, gloves, and strange tools that no ordinary law student should have been carrying. Investigators finally began to piece together what they had long feared. The polite young man with the easy smile might be the phantom killer who had haunted the western states. Bundy was calm during questioning, confident even, spinning explanations that sounded rehearsed. But the air around him had changed. For the first time, the predator sensed that his carefully built disguise was slipping. When investigators searched his apartment, they found eerie fragments, maps of mountainous areas, photographs of women, and casts of teeth that matched bite marks found on one of the victims. It wasn't enough for a conviction, but it was enough to keep him under scrutiny. The man who once toyed with police from a distance was now surrounded by them. His composure remained intact, his voice steady, his smile polite. He denied everything with the same convincing tone he used to lure his victims. But behind his eyes, the calm was breaking. Bundy thrived on control, and now that control was being stripped away piece by piece. In February 1976, he was convicted of kidnapping after surviving victim Carol DeRonch identified him as the man who had attempted to abduct her months earlier in Utah. She had escaped from his car, leaving behind a panic that would eventually unravel his empire of lies. Sentenced to 1 to 15 years in prison, Bundy played the role of the cooperative inmate, reading law books and offering legal advice to others. He smiled for cameras, appeared intelligent, even harmless. Yet even behind bars, his mind was working relentlessly. The confinement only intensified his obsession with control. He studied the system, memorized its weaknesses, and waited for the moment when he could exploit them. That moment came in June 1977, while being transported to the Pitkin County Courthouse in Aspen, Colorado, for a preliminary hearing on murder charges related to the disappearance of Corinne Campbell. Bundy requested access to the law library. Left unshackled and unsupervised, he opened a window on the second floor and leapt to the ground below. He disappeared into the surrounding forest, vanishing for 6 days. The escape embarrassed law enforcement and electrified the media. The man once admired for his intelligence had turned that very intellect against the system designed to contain him. When they finally recaptured him, thinner and bruised but smiling, Bundy showed no fear. The escape had only deepened his sense of invincibility. But Bundy wasn't finished. In December of that same year, he escaped again, this time from the Garfield County Jail. He had spent months filing down a hole in the ceiling of his cell, quietly sawing at metal until he could crawl into a vacant apartment above. On New Year's Eve, he slipped through the opening, changed into civilian clothes, and walked out of the front door unnoticed. This time, he was gone for good. The manhunt stretched across the country, but Bundy was already far away, heading south toward Florida, blending once more into anonymity. Each mile he put between himself and Colorado seemed to fuel his hunger again. The darkness that confinement had suppressed erupted with savage force. In January 1978, Ted Bundy arrived in Tallahassee, Florida, under the alias Chris Hagen. He rented a room in a boarding house near Florida State University, living among students who had no idea who he truly was. Within weeks he struck again. On the night of January 15th, he broke into the Chi Omega sorority house, moving room to room with a piece of firewood in his hand. In less than 15 minutes, he bludgeoned and strangled 2 women, Lisa Levy and Margaret Bowman, and brutally assaulted 2 others who miraculously survived. Witnesses later described hearing footsteps, a door creaking, then silence. When police arrived, the scene was one of unimaginable horror. Blood, broken glass, and the faint trace of a man who had moved through the house like a ghost. Bundy fled before dawn, his bloodlust unquenched. Only a few weeks later, he abducted 12-year-old Kimberly Leach from her junior high school in Lake City. It was his final crime, the act that sealed his fate. By February 15, 1978, Bundy was pulled over by Pensacola police officer David Lee. The car he was driving was stolen, his identification fake, and his demeanor calm but tense. When Lee attempted to handcuff him, Bundy fought savagely before finally being subdued. Once again the mask slipped. His charm vanished, replaced by an animalistic rage that startled even seasoned officers. The man who once smiled his way through interrogations was now silent, calculating, his blue eyes cold and vacant. The news of his capture sent shockwaves across the nation. The charming law student, the political volunteer, the well-spoken man with the perfect smile, he was the killer they had been searching for. Dozens of open cases from Washington to Colorado now converged on his name. Bundy's double life was over. The monster had been unmasked, and what lay beneath the surface was something far more terrifying than anyone had imagined. A man who had hidden his evil not behind a weapon or disguise, but behind the most. When Ted Bundy was finally captured in Florida, the illusion that had protected him for years collapsed in an instant. The man who once charmed professors, lovers, and politicians was now shackled and paraded before flashing cameras. His calm demeanor returned quickly, though. The confident smirk, the collected voice, the posture of a man who believed he was still in control. He studied the reporters as much as they studied him, adjusting his answers, modulating his tone, trying to shape his own narrative. The mask was cracked, but it wasn't gone. He had spent years mastering manipulation, and now he turned that skill toward survival. The courtroom became his new stage, the trial another performance in which he played the role of the misunderstood genius, the victim of circumstance, the innocent man surrounded by incompetence. The evidence, however, told a different story. The Florida investigators had been meticulous. Fibers from his clothing matched those found at the Chi Omega house, and bite marks on Lisa Levy's body were identified as Bundy's through forensic dental analysis, one of the first times such evidence had been used in court. The jurors watched as prosecutors displayed casts of his teeth, matching them to photographs of the wounds. The details were grisly, the conclusion undeniable. Still, Bundy smiled. He cross-examined witnesses himself, questioning their recollections with the smoothness of a practiced lawyer. There was a cold pride in his performance, as though he viewed the trial not as a reckoning, but as an opportunity to prove his superiority. When the verdict finally came, the mask slipped just slightly. The guilty verdict was read aloud, and the death sentence followed. For the first time, Ted Bundy was confronted with a fate he could not talk his way out of. But even as he awaited execution, Bundy refused to let go of control. From his cell at Florida State Prison, he gave interviews to journalists, psychologists, and even priests, each time tailoring his story to the listener. To some, he claimed innocence. To others, he admitted guilt, but framed himself as a victim of pornography, of society, of compulsion. He learned to speak in tones of remorse when it suited him, and to display arrogance when it didn't. The world was fascinated by him, the handsome killer who had fooled everyone. He used that fascination like oxygen, feeding on attention, shaping his legend with every word. Reporters described the strange calm in his eyes, the absence of shame, the slight amusement when asked about the women whose lives he had destroyed. His charm hadn't faded. It had only darkened, refined into something colder and more deliberate. In 1984, Bundy began cooperating with investigators on cold cases, hoping to delay his execution through usefulness. He described his crimes in vague, calculated detail, revealing just enough to keep interest alive, but never enough to give closure. He spoke of possessions, of moments of uncontrollable compulsion, of a force that overtook him. Each confession was laced with half-truths, distortions, and self-serving explanations. Detectives listened with growing frustration as Bundy seemed to dance around the truth, describing violence in the detached language of someone recounting a dream. He took pride in the power those stories still held, knowing that every revelation kept him alive a little longer. His victims' families waited for real answers that never came. For Bundy, even confession was a game of manipulation and dominance. The years stretched on. Appeals came and went, lawyers rotated, and the public's curiosity turned into morbid fascination. Television specials aired with grainy footage of Bundy smiling in court, his calmness unsettling to those who watched. To psychologists, he became a textbook example of psychopathy, intelligent, articulate, emotionally hollow. He could mimic empathy but never feel it. He could describe cruelty without flinching. Even in captivity, his aura of control persisted. He charmed guards, received letters from admirers, and studied every detail of his own myth. Bundy understood that as long as people were watching him, he still held power. Death to him wasn't just an end, it was the final stage of performance, and he intended to script it carefully. In the final weeks before his execution in January 1989, Bundy began a slow unraveling of his facade. He spoke more openly about his crimes, though always with detachment, never full remorse. He described returning to crime scenes, revisiting bodies, performing acts so disturbing that even seasoned investigators turned away. It wasn't contrition, it was control. By offering details, he dictated the terms of his own legacy. On the morning of January 24th, the prison was surrounded by crowds chanting and celebrating. The air was thick with anticipation, the cold Florida dawn cut by the light of camera flashes. As Bundy was led to the electric chair, witnesses described him as calm, his face expressionless, his eyes darting across the room as if searching for one last moment of connection. He was pronounced dead at 7:16 a.m., but his shadow lingered long after the current stopped. For years, investigators continued uncovering the full extent of his crimes, each discovery revealing new depths of cruelty. Many believed the number of victims was far higher than Bundy ever admitted, perhaps dozens more scattered across states and time. What made him terrifying wasn't only what he did, but how easily he moved among the innocent, how ordinary he appeared. Even in death, Ted Bundy remained a reminder that evil does not always come in the form of monsters or madmen. Sometimes it smiles, shakes your hand, and holds a conversation